My mother ripped my graduation photo off the wall in front of 136 guests. My father handed me an invoice for $550,000, representing every cent he spent raising me. My sister laughed as she snatched my car keys because my father had secretly transferred the title to her that morning. They even brought my boss to the party to fire me publicly while I stood there in silence. They thought they were destroying me. They thought they were cutting off a dead limb. They did not know they were actually signing their own eviction notice. My name is Nora and I am 34 years old. I am a forensic accountant who spent a decade cleaning up my family's financial messes from the shadows. If you have ever been the black sheep who kept the family afloat while being treated like a burden, hit like and subscribe to this channel. I am about to tell you how I turned the worst night of my life into the most profitable transaction I ever made. It was raining hard when I pulled up to the estate. My childhood home in Greenwich, Connecticut, looked like a fortress glowing against the dark sky. I parked my 10-year-old sedan between a silver Bentley and a bright red Porsche. I took a deep breath and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My father, Richard, had called me 3 times this week to ensure I would be there. His voice had sounded urgent, almost desperate. For a brief, foolish moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this birthday would be different. Maybe after 34 years of being the invisible daughter, they were finally ready to accept me. I smoothed down my skirt. I had come straight from the office, so I was wearing a simple gray suit. It was professional and practical. It was not the $10,000 designer gowns my sister Kylie wore, but it was me. I walked up the marble steps, and the heavy oak doors swung open. The sound of a live string quartet spilled out along with the overwhelming scent of expensive lilies and old money. I stepped inside and the air in the room seemed to vanish. 136 faces turned to look at me simultaneously. I recognized them all. There were aunts who never sent birthday cards. There were uncles who only called me when they needed free tax advice to hide their assets. There were business partners of my father who looked at me with thinly veiled pity. The room went dead silent. The music stopped. I forced a smile and stepped forward, searching for a friendly face. I saw my sister Kylie standing near the fireplace holding a crystal champagne flute. She looked radiant in a gold dress that hugged every curve. She saw me and whispered something to her husband Jamal, and they both snickered. Then the crowd parted like the Red Sea. My mother Beatrice glided toward me. She was holding a glass of wine and wearing a silk dress that cost more than my annual rent. She did not smile. She did not open her arms to hug me. She stopped 3 feet away and looked me up and down like I was a muddy stain on her pristine white carpet. "You are late, Nora," she said. Her voice was ice cold and loud enough for everyone to hear. "And look at what you are wearing. You look like a bank teller." I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to keep my voice steady. "Happy birthday to me," I thought. I reached out to hand her the small gift box I had brought, but she stepped back as if I were contagious. "Do not embarrass us tonight," she hissed. "We have important investors here and your father is making a big announcement. Go sit at the back." I looked where she was pointing with her manicured finger. It was not the main family table with the centerpiece of white roses. It was not even one of the guest tables. It was a small folding table set up near the swinging kitchen doors where the catering staff was stacking dirty plates. There was no tablecloth and only one plastic chair. "But Mom," I started to say. Beatrice cut me off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Do not call me that until you learn to dress and act like a Vance. Now move. You are blocking the view of people who actually matter." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as 136 pairs of eyes watched me walk the long walk of shame to the servant area. I sat down on the cold plastic chair and watched my family toast to their own greatness, unaware that the person they just humiliated held the keys to their entire kingdom. The waiters had just finished clearing the lobster bisque when the crystal chandeliers dimmed. A hush fell over the room as a massive projection screen lowered from the ceiling behind the main stage. I assumed this would be the part where they played a montage of baby photos, or perhaps a generic happy birthday message set to sentimental music. I should have known better. My father Richard stepped into the spotlight holding a laser pointer like he was about to present a quarterly earnings report. He cleared his throat and smiled that charming shark-like smile he used to close real estate deals. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice booming through the speakers. In business as in life, one must always evaluate their portfolio. We must distinguish between our performing assets and our draining liabilities. On the screen, a photo of my sister Kylie appeared. It was professionally retouched, showing her wearing a sash from a beauty pageant she had won 5 years ago. Beneath her face in bold, glowing green letters was the word asset. The crowd applauded politely, and some even cheered. Kylie waved from her seat, basking in the adoration, blowing kisses to the room. Then the slide changed with a jarring sound effect. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a few stifled giggles. A grainy, unflattering photo of me at 16 filled the screen. I had braces, my hair was a frizzy mess, and I was wearing oversized hand-me-down clothes because my mother refused to buy me anything new. Beneath my face in jagged, blinking red font was the word liability. I gripped the edge of my plastic table so hard my knuckles turned white. My father continued his presentation without a hint of irony. As you can see, some investments yield high returns, bringing beauty and status to the family name. Others, however, are simply sunk costs that continue to bleed resources. He clicked through more slides. There was Kylie on a yacht in Saint-Tropez. Then there was me sitting alone in a library surrounded by textbooks. There was Kylie driving her first convertible. Then a picture of me taking the public bus to my unpaid internship. The comparison was not just cruel, it was calculated to strip me of every ounce of dignity I had left. I could not take it anymore. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "This is not funny, Dad," I said, my voice shaking, but audible in the quiet room. "I have worked hard. I have a career." I pointed to the far wall near the kitchen entrance where a small framed certificate hung in the shadows. It was my certified public accountant license. It was the only acknowledgement of my existence I had ever been allowed to place in this house, and only because my father insisted it be displayed to prove to the IRS auditors that a qualified professional lived on the premises. "That certificate proves I am not a liability," I said, my voice trembling. My mother Beatrice moved faster than I expected. She marched over to the wall, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood. With a swift, violent motion, she ripped the frame off the hook. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the hall as she threw it onto the floor. She did not stop there. She ground her sharp stiletto heel into the paper certificate, tearing my name right down the middle. "Do not delude yourself, Nora," she spat, looking at me with pure venom. "This piece of paper has no value in this house. You are nothing but a bookkeeper we tolerate. And tonight, we are done tolerating. Sit down or get out." I barely had time to process the destruction of my professional license before a heavy leather binder slammed onto the plastic table in front of me. It landed with a dull thud that vibrated through my coffee cup, causing the cold liquid to spill onto my lap. My father, Richard, stood over me, his face flushed with the exhilaration of his performance. He looked like a prosecutor delivering the final piece of damning evidence in a murder trial. "You want to talk about value, Nora?" he announced, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "You claim you are an accountant. Fine, then audit this, since you have contributed absolutely nothing to this family's legacy except disappointment. Your mother and I decided it is time to balance the books. We have itemized every single expense we incurred, raising you from the day you were born until today." I opened the binder. My hands were trembling, but my eyes immediately locked onto the columns of numbers. It was an Excel spreadsheet printed on high-quality bond paper. It was meticulous. It was insane. I scanned the first page. Formula 1990 to 1992, $3,000. Orthodontics, 2004, $6,500. Summer camp, 2005, $2,000. It went on and on. He had even listed the cost of the gas used to drive me to school every morning for 12 years. I flipped to the back page. There was a section titled Room and Board. He had charged me $800 a month for living in my childhood bedroom starting from my 18th birthday, even though I was away at college for most of those years. And at the very bottom, there was a line item that made my stomach turn. Opportunity cost interest at 5% compounded annually. Richard tapped the bottom line with his finger. $550,450. That is the debt you owe us for the burden of your existence. You always talk about being independent. You always talk about fairness. Well, fairness dictates that you reimburse us for a failed investment. The room was so quiet, you could hear the rain lashing against the windows. I looked up at him. You are billing me for raising me, I asked, my voice quiet but steady. You are charging me interest for being your daughter. Richard did not blink. I am charging you for the resources you wasted. Resources that could have gone to Kylie. She actually appreciates what we give her. He leaned in closer, his expensive cologne suffocating me. You have two choices tonight, Nora. You can agree to a payment plan starting immediately with 75% of your salary garnered every month until this debt is settled, or you can leave right now and never contact us again. He straightened up and buttoned his jacket, looking around the room for approval. Pay up or get out, he said coldly. Those are your options. I looked at the number again. 550,000. It was a fortune. To anyone else in that room, it looked like a death sentence. But I am a forensic accountant. I look at numbers for a living. And as I stared at that total, I did not see a debt. I saw a confession. I saw desperation. And for the first time that night, I saw an opening. My hand instinctively shot out to grab the keys to my Audi A8 from the table, but I was too slow. My sister Kylie was faster. She snatched the key fob with a predatory swiftness that made her diamond bracelets jingle. She dangled the keys in front of my face like she was teasing a dog with a treat. Her eyes were gleaming with malicious delight as she pressed the panic button. From the driveway outside, the distinct alarm of my car chirped twice, flashing its lights in the rain. That is my car, Kylie, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low. I paid for the down payment. I make the monthly lease payments. Put the keys back. Kylie let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh that grated on my nerves. Oh, Nora, you are so naive it is actually painful to watch. She reached into her glittery clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the table next to the ridiculous invoice my father had just presented. It was a transfer of title document from the Department of Motor Vehicles, stamped and notarized that very morning. Technically, since Dad co-signed the loan to help you get a better interest rate, his name was on the title too, she explained with a smug grin. And this morning, being the generous father he is, he decided to gift his interest in the vehicle to his favorite daughter. She looked over at Richard, who nodded in agreement, his face stone cold. Consider it a down payment on the debt you owe us, Nora, Richard said. The car is now Kylie's property. You have been driving a luxury vehicle you do not deserve while your sister has been stuck with her 2-year-old Porsche. It is only fair we rectify that imbalance. I looked from my father to my sister, feeling the blood drain from my face. It was not just theft. It was a calculated ambush. They had planned this for weeks, waiting for the moment to inflict the maximum amount of pain. That car was my sanctuary. It was the one place I could go to escape their toxicity. It was how I got to the job that paid for their lifestyle. Kylie leaned in close, her perfume overwhelming my senses. She dropped the transfer paper onto my lap. Don't look so sad, she whispered loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. You look better on a bus anyway, Nora. It suits your tax bracket. Public transportation is so much more practical for someone with your limited prospects. The crowd chuckled. I saw my aunt whispering to my cousin, pointing at my empty hands. They were enjoying this. To them, this was not a family tragedy, it was dinner theater. Kylie twirled the keys around her finger and turned to her husband, Jamal. Honey, pull the car around. I do not want my new leather seats to get wet when we leave. I sat there frozen. They had taken my dignity, my professional reputation, and now my physical property. But as I watched Kylie sashay away with my keys, a cold realization settled in my chest. They were so focused on the asset they forgot about the liability attached to it. They forgot that the Audi was not just a car. It was a lease agreement. And while the title might have been transferred, the insurance and the primary financing liability were still linked to a very specific credit profile. Mine. They thought they had just stolen a car. In reality, they had just stolen a felony. I took a deep breath and let them have their moment. The bus ride home would give me plenty of time to make a phone call. Before I could even process the theft of my car, Jamal stepped forward. He smoothed his silk tie and adjusted his rimless glasses, looking every bit the high-powered corporate attorney he claimed to be. He placed a thick, stapled document on the table next to my father's ridiculous invoice. It landed with a heavy, authoritative sound that made the cutlery rattle. I took the liberty of drafting a solution for everyone involved. Jamal announced, loud enough for the room to hear. He looked at me with a condescending smile, the kind you give to a slow child. We all know you cannot pay $500,000, Nora. You are a salaried employee, not a business owner. We are not unreasonable people. We do not want to bankrupt you. We just want to protect the family assets from your instability. I looked down at the document. The title was written in bold capital letters, Voluntary Disownment and Debt Settlement Agreement. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but I kept my face impassive. Jamal tapped the paper with his expensive fountain pen. It is a standard quitclaim arrangement, he explained using his courtroom voice. Here's the deal. You sign this document effectively terminating all legal familial bonds. You waive your right to any future inheritance. You remove yourself from the family trust. You surrender any claim to the Vance name and estate in perpetuity. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the offer hang in the air. In exchange, Richard and Beatrice will graciously forgive the $550,000 debt you owe them. A clean slate. You walk away with zero debt, and we walk away with the assurance that you will never come back to beg for a handout. It is a win-win situation. I picked up the document and began to read. Jamal had indeed been thorough. Clause 4 stated that I was to be considered a legal stranger to the family from this moment forward. Clause 7 explicitly severed my power of attorney and any decision-making rights regarding family property. He thought he was stripping me of power. He thought he was cutting me off from the money. My heart began to race, but not from fear. It was from sheer disbelief at his incompetence. Jamal was a corporate lawyer, not an estate planner. He had no idea how the family finances were actually structured. He did not know that the only reason the bank allowed my father to keep the mortgages was because of my status as a blood relative guarantor. He did not know that my grandmother's trust had a specific clause that protected the estate only as long as the family remained intact. By creating a legal document that defined me as a stranger, Jamal was not just disowning me. He was triggering a default on 3 separate business loans and violating the core condition of the trust deed. He was handing me the detonator to a bomb he did not even know he was sitting on. I looked up at him. You drafted this yourself, I asked. Every word, he replied, puffing out his chest. It is ironclad, Nora. No loopholes. Once you sign, you are legally nobody to us. I looked at my parents. They were watching me with arms crossed, expecting me to cry or beg. They wanted to see me broken. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm. They wanted a stranger. I would give them a stranger. And strangers do not offer family discounts. I picked up the pen. Where do I sign? I asked. The ink was barely dry on the signature line when the final blow landed. It did not come from a relative. It came from the man I had made millions for over the last 5 years. Mr. Henderson, the CEO of the investment firm where I worked, stepped out from the shadow of the grand staircase. He was holding a glass of my father's scotch and looking at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Mr. Henderson was not just my boss. He was my father's golf partner. I had spent countless nights fixing his compliance reports and saving him from SEC violations. I thought our professional relationship was separate from my toxic family life. I was wrong. Nora, he said, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. Your father and I have been discussing your performance and your current situation. At Henderson Financial, we pride ourselves on integrity and family values. I stood up slowly. Mr. Henderson, my performance reviews have been perfect, I said. I generated 40% of the firm's profit last quarter. He waved his hand dismissively. This is not about numbers, Nora. It is about character. Watching how you have disrespected your parents tonight and seeing the level of instability you bring to your personal affairs, I have made a decision. We cannot have someone with such a severe moral deficit handling our high net worth clients. It is a liability to the firm's reputation. He pulled a white envelope from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto the table next to the car keys I had lost and the family bonds I had severed. You are terminated, effective immediately for cause. Your access to the building has already been revoked, and security will box up your personal effects. Do not try to log into the system. I looked at the envelope. Fired for cause meant no severance package, no unemployment benefits, no reference letter. In the span of 15 minutes, I had lost my car, my family name, my inheritance, and my career. My mother let out a small, triumphant laugh. My sister Kylie smirked and raised her champagne glass in a mock toast. They had stripped me bare. They had taken everything they thought defined me. I looked at Henderson. He was smiling at my father, probably thinking about the bonus deal they had just cut on the golf course. He thought he was cutting loose a problem employee. He had absolutely no idea that by firing me, he had just legally terminated the license agreement for the proprietary accounting software that ran his entire company. I had written the code myself on weekends, and I owned the copyright. He just fired the only person who knew the encryption key. I picked up my purse. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at Henderson and then at my father. You have all been very thorough, I said quietly. I hope you enjoy the consequences of your efficiency. I turned around and walked toward the heavy oak doors, my heels clicking on the marble for the last time. I walked out into the rain with nothing but the clothes on my back and the nuclear launch codes in my head. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating, like a wool blanket draped over a corpse. 136 people held their breath waiting for the explosion. They expected me to fall to my knees. They expected me to scream at my mother or beg my father to reconsider. They wanted a scene. They wanted confirmation that without them, I was nothing but a frightened little girl. I looked at the pen in my hand. It was a Mont Blanc that belonged to Jamal, a symbol of the status he desperately craved. I looked at the document that promised to erase my past and liberate my future. For years, I had stayed out of guilt. I had stayed because I thought that if I just worked hard enough or fixed enough problems, they would eventually love me. But as I looked at their faces, twisted in arrogant anticipation, I realized something profound. I was not losing a family. I was escaping a cult. I uncapped the pen with a calm, deliberate motion. The click echoed in the silent hall. I bent down and signed my name on the dotted line. The scratch of the ink against the paper was the only sound in the room. It was not a shaky signature. It was the boldest, clearest autograph I had ever written. I straightened up and slid the document across the table toward Jamal. He snatched it up, scanning the page to make sure I hadn't added any conditions. His eyes lit up when he saw the signature. It is done, he announced triumphantly. You are legally no longer a Vance. I did not look at him. I turned my gaze to my mother Beatrice, who was sipping her wine with a satisfied smirk. I looked at my father Richard, who was already turning away to signal the DJ to restart the music. I looked at my sister Kylie, who was dangling my car keys like a trophy. Make sure you keep that document safe, I said, my voice low and even. It is the most expensive piece of paper you will ever own. Richard laughed, harsh and dismissive. You are threatening us with what exactly, Nora? You have nothing. No job, no car, no money. Get out of my house. I held his gaze for one long second. I did not blink. I did not flinch. Do not regret this, I said. Do not regret this when the bill comes due. I turned on my heel and began the long walk to the exit. I passed my aunt, who quickly looked down at her plate. I passed the cousins who used to borrow money from me. They parted like the Red Sea, terrified of making eye contact with the exile. I did not rush. I walked with my head high, listening to the rhythm of my heels on the marble floor. It was a funeral march for their lifestyle, but they were too stupid to hear the music. I reached the massive double doors and pushed them open. The cold night air hit me instantly, biting through my thin suit. The rain was coming down in sheets, a relentless downpour that soaked me to the bone within seconds. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of the doors closing, sealing the warmth and the light inside. I stood on the driveway alone in the dark. No one came running after me. No one offered an umbrella. There was just the sound of the rain and the distant, muffled laughter from inside the mansion. I shivered, but not from the cold. I shivered because for the first time in 34 years, the weight of the world was off my shoulders. I began to walk down the long, winding driveway toward the main road, leaving the estate behind in the darkness. They thought they had thrown me to the wolves. They did not realize I was the leader of the pack. Back inside the mansion, the atmosphere shifted instantly from courtroom tension to a carnival of relief. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing me out into the storm, my father clapped his hands together. Music, he shouted to the band, too. And open the vintage Dom Perignon. Tonight we celebrate the restructuring of the Vance dynasty. The string quartet hesitated for a moment before launching into a lively, upbeat tempo. Waiters scrambled to pour champagne into crystal flutes. My mother Beatrice let out a long, dramatic sigh, as if she had just been released from a hostage situation. Finally, she said, smoothing her silk dress, "The air feels lighter already. I always said her negative energy was suffocating this house." She turned to a waiter and pointed at the wet footprints I had left near the door. "Clean that up immediately. I do not want a single trace of her left on my floors." My sister Kylie was already busy documenting the victory. She pulled out her phone and gathered Jamal and my parents for a group selfie. "Everyone smile," she chirped, holding up the Audi keys I had paid for. "Say bye-bye, Burden." They all flashed their brightest, whitest smiles. Kylie immediately uploaded the photo to her Instagram story with a caption that read, "Finally took out the trash. New car, new vibes, zero liabilities." She added a sparkle filter and tagged me, even though she assumed I would be too ashamed to look. Jamal was basking in the admiration of my father. "That was masterfully handled, Richard," he said, clinking his glass against my father's. "And that document is ironclad. We stripped her of everything. She cannot claim a penny of the estate, and she cannot touch the trust. You are completely insulated." "You are a genius, Jamal," my father replied, taking a deep swig of champagne. "We should have done this years ago, to the new era of the Vance family. Leaner, meaner, and infinitely more profitable." They drank. They laughed. They ate the expensive hors d'oeuvres that I had balanced the budget to afford. They were so intoxicated by their own cruelty that they failed to realize the basic mechanics of their own existence. Mile down the road in the back of a damp taxi, I watched the rain streak against the window. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from Instagram. Kylie had tagged me. I looked at their smiling faces one last time. Then I switched apps. I opened the secure administrator portal for the family office server. I typed in a 6-digit passcode. It was the date of my high school graduation, the one they had missed because they were vacationing in Cabo. A small loading bar appeared on my screen. It processed for 3 seconds before displaying a green checkmark. The text on the screen was simple. "System reset initiated. All guarantor links severed. Admin access revoked." I locked my phone and leaned back against the seat. Back at the party, the music was still playing and the champagne was still flowing. They were dancing on the deck of the Titanic, toasting the iceberg they had just struck. The party was just getting started, but the hangover was going to be lethal. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. I stretched out in my king-sized bed, wrapped in sheets that cost more than the dress my mother had insulted the night before. My parents probably imagined me shivering on a park bench or weeping in a cheap motel room. They had always seen what they wanted to see. They saw a bank teller. They never bothered to ask why I was the only forensic accountant in the city with a 3-month waiting list and a retainer fee that could buy a Porsche. I walked into my kitchen and made a double espresso. The silence in the apartment was not lonely. It was liberated. For the first time in my life, I did not wake up checking my phone for a crisis text from Kylie or a demand for money from my father. I took my coffee to the Marble Island and opened my laptop. It was time to begin what I called the unplugging. I logged into my primary banking portal. For 10 years, I had funneled my income into a sub-account titled Family Support. It was the invisible engine that kept the Vance lifestyle running. My father thought his real estate investments were covering the bills. In reality, his properties had been bleeding money since 2018. I had been quietly covering the deficits to protect his ego and my mother's social standing. I scrolled down the list of automatic transfers. It was extensive. Landscaping services for the estate, pool maintenance, country club membership fees, the premium health insurance policy for my parents, the lease payments for Kylie's lifestyle. I hovered my mouse over the master switch. With a single click, I deactivated the standing orders. One by one, the green lights on the screen turned red. Status terminated. Status revoked. Status canceled. Then came the most critical step. I accessed the mortgage portal for the family estate. My father was the primary borrower, but I was the guarantor. My credit score and my assets were the collateral that stopped the bank from foreclosing on his bad loans. I uploaded the PDF of the voluntary disownment agreement that Jamal had so helpfully drafted. I highlighted the clause where it stated I was no longer a family member or a financial participant in the Vance estate. I hit submit, requesting an immediate removal of my guarantor status based on a material change in legal relationship. I picked up my phone and dialed David, my personal attorney. He answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Nora," he said. "You are calling early. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect, David," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. "I need you to execute the scorched earth protocol we discussed last year." There was a pause on the line. David knew exactly what that meant. It meant filing the liens enforcing the intellectual property rights for my software and notifying the IRS that I was no longer preparing the Vance family tax returns. "Are you sure, Nora?" he asked. "Once we start this domino effect, there is no going back. Your father will face immediate liquidity issues." I looked out at the city below me. I thought about the invoice from my childhood. I thought about my graduation photo on the floor. "I am sure," I said. "Jamal provided me with a legal exit strategy last night. I am just following the terms of the contract. Proceed with everything." I hung up the phone. The clock on the wall read 9 a.m. The banks were opening. The notifications would start hitting my father's email in exactly 5 minutes. I sat back and waited for the show to begin. The glass doors of Henderson Financial slid open with a smooth, silent glide. Mr. Henderson strode through the lobby, nodding to the receptionist with the confident air of a man who owned the world. He was in a particularly good mood. The weekend at the Vance estate had been productive. Not only had he solidified his partnership with Richard, but he had also removed a thorn from his side. Firing Nora felt like a power move, a necessary trim of dead weight. He hummed a tune as he entered his corner office, which offered a panoramic view of the financial district. He hung his coat on the rack and settled into his leather chair. It was 8:30 in the morning. The markets were opening in 30 minutes. It was time to review the weekend's global transaction reports. He tapped the spacebar on his computer to wake it up. The familiar blue logo of the firm appeared, followed by the login prompt. He typed in his password and hit enter, expecting to see the complex dashboard of real-time analytics that gave his firm its competitive edge. Instead, the screen flickered and went black. A moment later, a large red box appeared in the center of the monitor. The text was simple white and terrifyingly final. Critical error. System license expired. Unauthorized user detected. Access terminated. Henderson frowned. He tapped the enter key again. Nothing happened. He tried to restart the machine. The same red box appeared immediately. He grabbed his phone and punched the speed dial for the IT department. "Gary, get up here now," he barked into the receiver. "The system is down and the market opens in 20 minutes. Gary, the IT director, arrived less than 60 seconds later. He looked pale and he was sweating. He did not look like a man dealing with a simple server glitch. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Fix it," Henderson demanded, pointing at the red screen. "I have client portfolios to manage." "I cannot fix it, sir," Gary said, his voice cracking. "We are locked out. Completely." "What do you mean you cannot fix it?" Henderson yelled, slamming his hand on the desk. "You are the IT director. Reboot the server. Restore the backup. Do something." Gary took a step back. "Sir, you do not understand. This is not a glitch. The entire trading platform, the client database, the compliance algorithms, it all runs on the Vance Core engine." "I know what it runs on," Henderson snapped. "Just restart it." "We cannot," Gary whispered. "We do not own the software, sir. We never did." When Nora built the system 5 years ago, she retained full intellectual property rights. She granted the firm a revocable user license contingent on her continued employment as the chief financial officer. Henderson froze. The blood drained from his face as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He remembered the envelope he had tossed onto the table at the party. He remembered the smug look on his face when he told Nora she was terminated for cause. "Are you telling me," Henderson said, his voice barely a whisper, "that by firing her, I shut down my own company?" Gary nodded grimly. The moment her employee status was updated to terminated in the HR database, the software automatically triggered the kill switch. Without the encryption key, which only Nora has, we are looking at encrypted gibberish. We cannot see client balances. We cannot execute trades. We do not even know whose money is where. Henderson sank back into his chair. The red warning light on his screen pulsed like a heartbeat. He had fired the architect of his success to please a washed-up real estate developer. The phone on his desk began to ring. Then the second line. Then the third. The markets were open, and Henderson Financial was blind, deaf, and dumb. While Henderson was staring at his black screen in Manhattan, my sister Kylie was cruising down Interstate 95 in my Audi A8. She was doing 80 miles an hour in the fast lane, wearing oversized sunglasses and talking on her phone via the Bluetooth system I had paid for. She was bragging to her best friend about how easy it had been to take everything from me. "I bet she is crying on a bus right now." Kylie laughed, her voice echoing through the luxury cabin. "She actually thought she could keep this car. Dad put it in my name in 5 minutes. It is basically my birthright." She reached out to turn up the volume on the Bang & Olufsen sound system. That was when the music died. It did not fade out. It cut abruptly, replaced by a harsh, dissonant chime that blasted through the speakers. The digital dashboard, which usually displayed the navigation and speedometer, flashed a bright, aggressive red. A message appeared on the center console screen. "Security alert. Unauthorized operator detected. Remote immobilization sequence initiated." Kylie frowned, tapping the screen. "What is this?" she muttered. The car did not respond to her touch. Instead, the engine power cut completely. 1 second she was flying past traffic, the next, the accelerator pedal went dead under her foot. The heavy luxury sedan began to decelerate rapidly in the middle of the highway. Horns blared around her as 18-wheelers swerved to avoid hitting the sudden obstacle. Panic flared in Kylie's chest. She gripped the steering wheel, but the power steering had deactivated, making the wheel heavy and almost impossible to turn. With sheer adrenaline, she managed to muscle the dying car across 3 lanes of traffic, narrowly missing a delivery truck, before grinding to a halt on the narrow shoulder of the highway. "You stupid piece of junk!" she screamed, hitting the steering wheel. She pushed the start button furiously. Nothing happened. The car was a brick. She grabbed the door handle to get out and call a tow truck. The handle would not budge. She tried the passenger door. Locked. She tried the window controls. Dead. The Audi had entered what the manufacturer calls deadlock mode, designed to trap thieves inside the vehicle until law enforcement arrives. The air conditioning had cut off with the engine. It was mid-July and 90 degrees outside with high humidity. The black leather interior began to heat up instantly, turning the cabin into a greenhouse. Kylie banged on the glass, screaming at the passing cars, but the soundproofing of the luxury vehicle meant no one could hear her. On the dashboard screen, a new message appeared. Owner reported stolen. GPS location sent to law enforcement. Please remain in the vehicle. Kylie stared at the words. She did not understand. She had the title in her purse, but she did not understand the difference between holding a title and being the leaseholder of record. When I called the leasing company at 9 a.m., I informed them that the vehicle was no longer in my possession and that I was ceasing payments immediately due to theft by a family member. Since my name was the only one on the financial contract, the leasing company did not care about my father's internal family transfer. To them, this was asset misappropriation. They did exactly what I paid them to do. They secured the asset. 5 minutes later, blue and red lights flashed in the rearview mirror. A state trooper pulled up behind the Audi. Kylie sobbed with relief, thinking she was being rescued. She did not realize that to the officer approaching with his hand on his holster, she was not a damsel in distress. She was a suspect in a grand theft auto case, driving a stolen vehicle that had just been remotely disabled by the rightful owner. As the heat rose inside the car, Kylie Vance was about to learn that a title transfer is just a piece of paper, but a lease agreement is the law. At the very same moment, my sister was sweating in a locked car on the interstate. My mother Beatrice was holding court at Le Jardin, the most exclusive French bistro in Greenwich. She was seated at the best table by the window, surrounded by 3 of her closest frenemies. These were women who measured their self-worth by the carat size of their diamonds and the exclusivity of their zip codes. Beatrice was in high spirits. She had just finished recounting a highly edited version of the previous night's events. So we finally decided to let Nora go, she said, taking a delicate sip of her Sancerre. It was heartbreaking, of course, but Richard and I agreed that we could not keep enabling her mediocrity. It was time for tough love. We are focusing all our energy on Kylie and Jamal now. The dynamic is just so much healthier without that heavy energy in the house. Her friends nodded sympathetically, pretending to care while secretly judging her facelift. The waiter approached the table with a leather bill folder. Beatrice waved her hand magnanimously. Put it all on mine, she announced loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. It is a celebration after all. She pulled out the Centurion card, the heavy black titanium rectangle that screamed unlimited spending power. She dropped it onto the tray with a satisfying clatter. The waiter bowed and retreated. Beatrice smiled, continuing her monologue about the upcoming renovations she planned for the estate now that she had reclaimed my bedroom space. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. He was not smiling. He walked slowly, holding the black card between his thumb and forefinger, like it was a soiled napkin. He leaned down and whispered discreetly, "I am terribly sorry, Madame Vance, but the card was declined." Beatrice laughed a sharp bark of disbelief. "Do not be ridiculous," she said loudly. "That is an Amex Centurion. It has no limit. Run it again. You obviously made a mistake. I ran it 3 times. Madame, the waiter said, his voice remaining polite but firm. The issuer has flagged the account as closed. Do you have another form of payment? The table went silent. The other women exchanged glances. In their world, a declined card was worse than a terminal illness. It was a social death sentence. Beatrice's face turned a deep shade of crimson. "This is incompetence," she hissed, snatching her phone from her Hermes bag. "I am calling the concierge line right now. You will be fired for this." She put the phone on speaker, wanting her friends to hear the bank apologize to her. The line rang twice before a representative answered. Diamond Service Desk. This is Sarah. How can I assist you? Sarah, this is Beatrice Vance, my mother barked. I am at a lunch, and your incompetent system just declined my card. Fix it immediately before I have my husband pull all our accounts. There was a brief clicking sound of a keyboard. I apologize, Mrs. Vance, the representative said calmly. I see the issue here. The primary cardholder contacted us at 9 a.m. this morning to remove all authorized users and freeze the account due to a separation of assets. Beatrice froze. My husband did no such thing, she snapped. Richard is in a meeting. He would never cut off my card. I am afraid you are mistaken about the account ownership, Mrs. Vance, the voice on the speaker said clearly. This is not Richard Vance's account. The primary account holder and the sole liability bearer for this credit line is Nora Vance. Since you are only an authorized user on her account, she has the legal right to revoke your access at any time. The silence at the table was deafening. Beatrice sat there, her mouth slightly open, the phone still in her hand. For 20 years she had swiped that card believing it was her husband's money. She never knew that because of Richard's bankruptcy in the 90s, every single credit card in the family wallet was actually backed by my credit score. I don't understand, Beatrice stammered. It is quite simple, the representative continued. Nora Vance has reported this card as no longer authorized for family use. Would you like me to destroy the physical card, or will you be surrendering it to the merchant? Beatrice looked up. The waiter was still standing there. Her friends were staring at her with a mix of horror and glee. She had just bragged about kicking me out, only to find out I was the one paying for her lobster salad. She slowly reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, the only cash she had. It was not enough to cover the tip, let alone the $800 lunch. One of her friends sighed loudly and opened her own purse. Put it away, Beatrice, she said with a pitying smile. I will get this. We can't have you washing dishes in that dress. My father Richard was in the middle of a celebratory lunch at the country club when his phone rang. It was the private line of Mr. Sterling, the senior vice president of commercial lending at First Citadel Bank. Richard answered with a mouthful of steak, confident that Sterling was calling to congratulate him on his newfound family freedom. He was wrong. 10 minutes later, Richard was sprinting through the marble lobby of the bank, sweating through his Italian suit. He burst into Sterling's office without knocking. What is the meaning of this, Arthur? He demanded, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk. My secretary said you are freezing my operating accounts. Do you know who I am? Mr. Sterling did not stand up. He did not offer a handshake. He did not smile. He simply adjusted his glasses and pointed to the chair opposite him. Sit down, Richard, he said coldly. This is not a social call, and yes, I know exactly who you are. You are a client who is currently in default on a $5 million commercial line of credit. Richard laughed nervously, sinking into the chair. Default? That is absurd. I paid the interest last month. You have my financial statements. Sterling slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a formal notice of acceleration. We received a notification at 9 this morning regarding a material change in the structure of the borrowing entity, he explained. Specifically, the immediate withdrawal of the primary guarantor. Richard frowned, confusing, clouding his arrogance. Guarantor. I am the borrower. I do not need a guarantor. The Vance name is the collateral. Sterling looked at him with genuine pity. Richard, let us be realistic. Your real estate ventures have not turned a profit since 2012. Your personal credit score is barely 600. The only reason this bank extended a $5 million line of credit to you was because it was fully secured by the personal assets and the 820 credit score of your daughter Nora. Richard felt the room spin. That is a lie, he sputtered. Nora is just a bookkeeper. She does not have assets. She has a trust fund from her grandmother that she never touched. Sterling corrected him. She has a diversified portfolio of tech stocks. And she has an impeccable financial reputation. Clause 4, Section B of your loan agreement states that if the guarantor withdraws or ceases to be a family member, the full principal balance becomes due immediately. Sterling tapped the file on his desk. We received a copy of a voluntary disownment agreement signed by you and notarized yesterday. It explicitly states that Nora Vance has no further legal ties to your estate. By signing that paper, Richard, you effectively told the bank that our insurance policy had just walked out the door. But that was just to teach her a lesson. Richard stammered, his face turning pale gray. It was not supposed to be real. It looks very real to our legal department, Sterling said, closing the file. You have 24 hours to wire $5 million to the settlement account. If the funds are not received by close of business tomorrow, we will begin foreclosure proceedings on all collateralized assets. That includes your commercial properties, your investment accounts, and the Greenwich estate. Richard sat there paralyzed. He had walked into the bank thinking he was a king. He was about to walk out realizing he was a beggar living in a castle built on his daughter's credit score, and the rent was finally due. My phone sat on the white marble kitchen island like a grenade that had finally pulled its own pin. The first call came in at exactly 11:45 in the morning. That was approximately the amount of time it would take for my father to storm out of Mr. Sterling's office and scream at his driver to take him home. The caller ID flashed Dad with a photo I had taken of him years ago, where he looked powerful and in control. He did not look like that anymore. I did not reach for the phone. I did not feel that familiar spike of adrenaline that used to hit me whenever he called expecting me to fix a disaster he had created. Instead, I simply picked up my porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. The steam warmed my face as I watched the phone vibrate against the marble. It rang for 45 seconds straight, then silence. Then it started ringing again immediately. Then my mother called, then the house landline, then Kylie, then my father again. It was a symphony of panic, and I was the conductor who had walked off the stage. Within 15 minutes, I had 36 missed calls. The notifications were stacking up on my lock screen like Tetris blocks. I decided to swipe open the notification center not to answer, but to read the voice-to-text transcriptions of the voicemails. It was fascinating to watch the rapid evolution of their emotions. The first voicemail from Richard was pure aggression. "Nora, pick up the damn phone. There has been a clerical error at the bank, and Sterling is being an idiot. Call him and tell him you are still the guarantor. Do it now." The second message from Beatrice was filled with indignation. "You ungrateful child! You embarrassed me in front of the ladies." My card was declined. "Turn it back on this instant or so. Help me, God. I will have your father cut you out of the will." I chuckled at that one. She still did not grasp that there was nothing left to inherit. By the 10th call, the tone had shifted from anger to confusion. This one was from Kylie. "Hey, Nora, my car is acting weird and the cops are here saying it is stolen. Tell them it is a mistake. This isn't funny anymore. Pick up." And then the 30th call back to Richard. But this time the aggression was gone, replaced by a tremble of genuine fear. "Nora, please. They are talking about foreclosure. They are saying 24 hours. Just call me back. We can talk about this. We can fix this." I set the cup down on the coaster. For years, I had been their emotional support animal. I had been the fixer. I had been the sponge that absorbed their toxicity so they could shine. Seeing them unravel the moment I stepped away validated everything I had done. They were not calling a daughter. They were calling tech support. They were calling the ATM because it had stopped spitting out cash. I tapped the side button on my phone, silencing the ringer completely. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city below. The rain from last night had cleared, leaving the sky a brilliant, piercing blue. I imagined my father screaming into his phone in the back of his limousine. I imagined my mother trying to explain to her friends why she had to pay cash. I imagined Kylie sweating in the back of a police cruiser. I felt a profound sense of peace. The silence in my apartment was heavy and expensive and beautiful. Let them ring, let them leave voicemails. I had spent 34 years listening to them. Today they were going to learn how to listen to the silence. Back at the estate, Jamal was pacing around the library trying to project an air of command over a situation that was rapidly spiraling into chaos. Richard was slumped in his leather armchair, clutching a glass of scotch, while Beatrice was frantically texting her friends to cancel their upcoming spa weekend. The air in the room was thick with the smell of panic and expensive alcohol. "Stop calling her Richard Jamal," commanded, snatching the phone from his father-in-law's hand. "You are playing right into her hands. This is exactly what she wants. She wants to see you beg. Do not give her the satisfaction." "But the bank gave me 24 hours. Richard groaned. "They are going to take the building, Jamal. They are going to take everything. Let them try." Jamal scoffed, adjusting his silk tie. I am a partner at one of the biggest law firms in the city. I will file an emergency injunction. I will sue Nora for tortious interference, malicious breach of contract, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. By the time I am done with her, she will be selling that penthouse just to pay my legal fees. He marched over to the massive wall safe hidden behind a portrait of Richard's father. Open this, he ordered. I need to review the original deeds and the incorporation papers for the family LLCs. I am going to find a loophole that buries her. Richard punched in the combination with trembling fingers. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing stacks of yellowing documents and leather-bound ledgers. Jamal grabbed the first stack, which contained the property records for the Hamptons vacation home. He slapped it onto the desk and began to read, his finger tracing the legal jargon with confident speed. See here, he muttered. The property is held in the Vance Family Trust. Standard structure. He flipped to the page defining the trustees. His finger stopped. He blinked. He brought the paper closer to his eyes. That is odd, he whispered. What is it? Beatrice asked, looking up from her phone. The trust designates a primary administrative trustee, Jamal said slowly. The person with sole authority to sell, encumber, or borrow against the property. It says here the trustee is Nora Vance. He threw that file aside and grabbed the next one. It was the operating agreement for Richard's development company. He flipped to the section on capital controls. Any withdrawal over $10,000 requires the counter-signature of the chief financial officer. He flipped to the definitions page. The CFO is defined irrevocably as Nora Vance. Jamal began to sweat. He grabbed the deed to the estate they were sitting in. He grabbed the insurance policies. He grabbed the investment portfolio summaries. Every single document led back to the same conclusion. Nora was not just a contributor. She was the legal keystone. The entire architecture of the family's wealth was built on her credit, her credentials, and her signature. And then the horrific realization hit him. He looked at the voluntary disownment agreement lying on the desk, the one he had been so proud of drafting. Clause 4. The complete severance of legal ties. Oh my God, Jamal whispered, his voice trembling. What? Richard snapped. Did you find a way to sue her? No, Jamal said, sinking into the chair. I found the trigger. Every single one of these assets has a protection clause. If the key person is removed or resigns, the assets freeze or liquidate automatically to pay off debts. He looked at Richard with wide, terrified eyes. When I wrote that document to disown her, I thought I was cutting her off from your money. I did not realize I was actually cutting the brake lines on a car moving at 100 miles an hour. We cannot sue her, Richard. We legally agreed to this. We pulled the trigger on ourselves. The rumble of diesel engines shattered the afternoon peace of the gated community. Two massive box trucks with the logo Tri-State Asset Recovery backed right up to the front steps of the Vance estate. They did not ring the doorbell, they did not ask for permission, they had a writ of replevin and a court order authorizing immediate seizure of collateralized assets. Richard ran out onto the porch wearing a silk bathrobe and slippers, his face purple with rage. Get off my property, he screamed, waving his arms like a madman. I will sue every single one of you. Do you know who I am? I am Richard Vance. The lead repo officer, a man built like a linebacker with a clipboard in his hand, did not even look up. We are here for the secured assets listed in the default judgment. Mr. Vance, he said calmly. That includes the Roche-Beaubois leather sectional, the antique Steinway piano, and the art collection in the foyer. Boys, let's move. A team of movers in blue jumpsuits marched past Richard as if he were invisible. They entered the grand hallway and immediately began taking the paintings off the walls. These were paintings Richard had bragged about for decades, claiming they were heirlooms. In reality, they were bought with a loan that had just been called in. Richard lunged at a mover who was lifting a heavy bronze statue. Put that down, he roared, grabbing the man's shoulder. That is mine. The reaction was instant. The lead officer stepped in between them. He grabbed Richard's wrist and twisted it slightly, not enough to break it, but enough to immobilize him. Sir, that is assault on a court officer, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. If you touch my men or interfere with this operation one more time, I will zip tie your hands behind your back and call the sheriff to haul you away for obstruction. Do you want to go to jail in your slippers?" Richard froze. He looked at the officer's cold eyes and realized this was not a negotiation. He pulled his hand back, rubbing his wrist. "Look at the driveway," the officer said, pointing with his chin. Richard looked. The commotion had attracted an audience. The neighbors were standing at the edge of the lawn. These were the same people who had attended the party 2 nights ago, drinking his champagne and laughing at his jokes. Now Mrs. Higgins from next door was holding up her iPhone, filming the entire scene. The man who lived across the street was walking his dog, pausing to watch with a smirk on his face. "They are filming you, Richard!" Beatrice shrieked from the doorway, covering her face with her hands. "Do something! Make them stop!" "I can't do anything," Richard whispered, watching his prized Italian sofa being loaded into the dirty back of a truck. The neighbors were not just watching. They were witnessing the liquidation of a lie. The Vance family facade was being dismantled piece by piece and carried away on a diesel truck, while the whole neighborhood watched in high definition. For the first time in his life, Richard Vance felt small. He retreated into the empty hallway, closing the door to hide from the cameras, but he could not shut out the sound of his empire being repossessed. The yellow taxi idled at the bottom of the driveway because the driver refused to go through the gates, fearing he would not get paid. Kylie Vance, who usually arrived home in a blaze of glory behind the wheel of a luxury sedan, had to walk the final 100 yards in her Louboutins, which were now covered in mud. She looked like a beauty queen who had survived a hurricane. Her mascara was running, and her hair was frizzy from the humidity of the car that had trapped her for an hour on the interstate. She stormed into the house, ready to scream at her father for the humiliation she had endured at the hands of the state police. But the hallway was empty. The repo men had already cleared out the foyer, leaving only dust outlines where the furniture used to be. Kylie did not care about the furniture. She cared about her audience. She needed to vent. She needed validation. She reached into her purse and pulled out her iPhone, preparing to record a tearful story about how she was being victimized by a jealous sister and a corrupt police force. She tapped the rose gold icon of her Instagram app. Instead of her curated feed of selfies and sponsored posts, she was greeted by a stark white login screen. She frowned and typed in her password. A red banner appeared at the top. Account disabled. She tried again. Account permanently disabled. Her heart stopped. This account was not just a hobby. It was her livelihood. It had 2 million followers. It was how she paid for her clothes, her trips, and the credit card bills that her parents could no longer cover. She frantically opened her email to find the explanation. There was a message from the Meta legal team titled, "Notice of Multiple Copyright Strikes." She opened it, reading through the legalese with trembling hands. "We have received 50 separate notices of intellectual property infringement regarding the commercial use of private locations and assets without a property release form. As a result, your account has been terminated." She scrolled down to see the specific violations. Photo 1. Kylie in the Audi A8. Claimant owner of vehicle lease. Photo 2. Kylie on the balcony of the Manhattan penthouse. Claimant owner of property. Photo 3. Kylie posing with the abstract sculpture in the foyer. Claimant owner of art collection. Nora. Kylie let out a scream that echoed through the empty house. Every single photo that had built her brand was taken in Nora's car, in Nora's secret apartment that Kylie had broken into, or in front of art that Nora had legally purchased. Nora had not just reported one photo. She had systematically flagged every single post from the last 3 years where her property appeared in the background. "My brand deals!" Kylie shrieked, dropping her phone on the floor. "I have a $10,000 contract with Fashion Nova due today. I have a sponsorship with Skin Glow. They will sue me for breach of contract." She sank to the floor right where the antique rug used to be. She realized with horrifying clarity that she was not an influencer. She was a squatter. She had built an entire digital empire using her sister's life as the backdrop. And now the landlord had just evicted her from the internet. She was no longer Kylie Vance the star. She was just an unemployed girl sitting in a dark hallway with no car, no money, and no followers left to care. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the trading floor at Henderson Financial resembled the deck of a sinking ship. The red warning screens were still pulsing on every monitor, casting a hellish glow over the faces of 50 traders who were unable to execute a single transaction. The phones were ringing off the hooks, a cacophony of angry ringtones that made it impossible to think. These were not just retail investors calling. These were institutional clients, pension fund managers, and hedge fund directors demanding to know why they could not access their liquidity. Mr. Henderson sat in his office, his tie loosened and his forehead glistening with sweat. Standing in front of him was the company's general counsel, a man named Robert, who looked like he was about to have a stroke. "We just received a cease and desist order from the State Teachers Retirement Fund," Robert shouted, slamming a heavy file onto the desk. "They are demanding an immediate audit of their $200 million portfolio. They tried to log in to check their quarterly yield and got a system error. If we do not produce a certified balance sheet by 5 p.m., they are filing a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud." "Do you know what that means, Henderson?" "It means the SEC shuts us down tomorrow morning." Henderson looked at the black screen of his computer. "Tell IT to bypass the security," he stammered. "Hack it if you have to." Gary, the IT director, was standing in the corner looking defeated. "We tried, Sir." Gary said, his voice trembling. "We tried to brute force the encryption. The system interpreted it as a cyber attack. It just initiated a level 4 lockdown. It is not just the client data anymore. The payroll system is frozen. The email server is down. We are completely dead in the water. The only person with the master encryption token is Nora." Henderson felt the bile rise in his throat. He looked at the empty desk outside his glass wall where Nora used to sit. For 5 years he had ignored her. He had underpaid her. He had fired her to impress a client who was now bankrupt. He realized with terrifying clarity that the quiet woman in the gray suit was not just an employee. She was the oxygen in the room, and he had just sucked it all out. He grabbed his personal cell phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He dialed Nora's number. It rang once, twice. He held his breath, praying she would answer. "Hello. This is Nora Vance." Her voice was cool, calm, and professional, utterly detached from the chaos she had orchestrated. "Nora, thank God," Henderson gasped. "Listen to me. There has been a terrible mistake. The firing last night was it was a misunderstanding. A lapse in judgment. We are family here at Henderson Financial. I need you to come in right now. We need the encryption key, Nora. The clients are panicking." There was a long pause on the other end. Henderson could hear the faint sound of jazz music playing in the background. She was relaxing. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mr. Henderson," Nora said smoothly. "As you pointed out last night, I was terminated for cause due to a moral deficit. Company policy strictly forbids non-employees from accessing sensitive financial data. It would be a liability, Nora." "Please," Henderson begged, his voice cracking. "I will double your salary. I will give you a bonus. Just tell me the code." "I am sorry, but my consulting rates have changed significantly since I became an independent contractor," Nora replied. "I am no longer an employee, Mr. Henderson. If you want my help, we will need to negotiate a new contract. And my price for saving your company is going to be very different from my salary." Henderson opened his mouth to argue, but the line went dead. She had hung up. He looked at Robert, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "She is not coming back," Henderson whispered. "Not unless we pay." Henderson hit the redial button before the screen on his phone even went dark. His fingers were trembling so violently that he missed the icon on the first try. He was a man who had built his career on the belief that everyone had a price. He assumed Nora was simply playing hardball. She was negotiating. She wanted to hear him beg, and then she would name a number. He was prepared to pay it. He would pay anything to stop the red warning lights from pulsing on his monitor. Nora answered on the third ring. She did not say hello. She simply breathed into the receiver, waiting for him to speak. "Nora, listen to me," Henderson said, his voice rapid and desperate. I will not insult you with a salary offer. You want a consulting contract. Fine. You want to be an external vendor. Done. Just name your rate. I will have accounting wire the retainer immediately. Just give me the encryption key. There was a pause on the line. Henderson could hear the faint sound of a page turning. It sounded like a magazine. My rate structure is quite specific for emergency forensic reconstruction, Nora said, her voice calm and detached. For a client with a history of wrongful termination and hostile workplace practices, my standard fee is $5,000 per hour with a minimum 40-hour retainer paid up front. Henderson felt the blood drain from his face. $5,000 an hour was more than he paid the senior partners at his law firm. It was extortion. But he looked up at the glass wall of his office. Outside on the trading floor, the traders were standing up, shouting into their phones, trying to calm down furious investors. The ticker tape on the wall was frozen. He was losing millions by the minute. 5,000, Henderson choked out. It is robbery, but I accept. I agree to the terms. Send over the DocuSign. I will wire the $200,000 retainer right now. Just unlock the system, Nora. Please? I appreciate your flexibility, Mr. Henderson. Nora continued smoothly. However, there is one final complication. I have just reviewed my calendar for the upcoming fiscal year. What complication? Henderson shouted, gripping the edge of his mahogany desk. I agreed to the money. What else do you want? It is not about what I want. It is about availability, Nora said. As an independent contractor, I have to manage my workload carefully to maintain my work-life balance. And unfortunately, looking at my schedule, I am fully booked. Booked? Henderson screamed. You have been unemployed for less than 24 hours. How can you be booked? I am booked with self-respect, Nora replied. I am also booked with a long overdue vacation and a series of very important spa appointments. I simply do not have a single opening to rescue a company that publicly humiliated me. My next available slot for new clients is in January of next year. January. Henderson whispered, his voice barely audible. We will be bankrupt by Friday. That does sound like a significant management challenge, Nora said. Perhaps you should ask my father for a loan. I hear he is looking for liquidity too. Good luck, Mr. Henderson. The line went dead with a soft final click. Henderson stared at the phone in his hand. He did not try to redial. He knew it was over. He looked at Robert, the general counsel, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes. He looked at Gary, the IT director, who was shaking his head in defeat. Henderson let the phone slip from his fingers. It hit the desk with a crack. The silence in the office was heavier than the shouting outside. He had just been given an invoice for his arrogance, and he could not afford to pay it. The sun was beginning to set over the Vance estate, casting long shadows across the empty rooms where the furniture used to be. Jamal sat on the floor of Richard's study, surrounded by a sea of yellowing documents. He had spent the last 5 hours desperately searching for a loophole to save his reputation and his marriage. He had read through tax returns, land surveys, and insurance policies, but it was a dusty leather-bound folder at the bottom of the safe that finally caught his attention. It was labeled Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Vance, dated 1999. Jamal opened it, his eyes scanning the legal boilerplate. It seemed like a standard inheritance document transferring the property to Richard upon Eleanor's death. But Jamal was a lawyer, and he knew that the devil was always in the details. He turned to page 14, a section titled Conditions of Tenancy. He began to read, and his breath hitched in his throat. Clause 7, subsection C, also known as the Moral Clause. The text was clear and devastating. It read, I, Eleanor Vance, believing that a home is the foundation of family unity, hereby bequeath this estate to my son, Richard Vance, on the strict condition that it remains a sanctuary for all my descendants. Should any direct descendant be unjustly exiled, disowned, or removed from the premises against their will, the ownership of this property shall immediately revert to said exiled descendant to ensure their protection. Jamal read the paragraph again and again. His hands began to shake. He looked at the voluntary disownment agreement lying on the desk, the document he had drafted, the document he had forced Nora to sign, the document that explicitly stated Nora was being disowned and removed from the family. He had not just kicked Nora out, he had legally triggered the reversion clause of the will. By documenting the disownment so thoroughly, he had created the perfect evidence to strip Richard of the house. Richard Jamal whispered, his voice trembling. "Come here." Richard walked into the room holding a glass of scotch, looking defeated. "What is it? Did you find a way to stop the foreclosure?" he asked. "No," Jamal said, looking up with eyes full of terror. "I found something much worse. I found out who actually owns this house." "What are you talking about?" Richard snapped. "I own this house. My mother left it to me. She left it to you with conditions," Jamal said, holding up the will. "She left it to you only if you kept the family together. But yesterday, when we forced Nora to sign that disownment paper, we violated the moral clause." He dropped the bombshell. "According to your mother's will, the moment Nora walked out that door, the title of this estate automatically transferred. We are not just facing foreclosure, Richard. We are trespassing. This isn't your house anymore. It belongs to Nora." Richard snatched the yellowing will from Jamal's hands, tearing the corner in his haste. "You are interpreting it wrong," he spat, his face flushing a deep purple. "Mother was senile when she wrote this. No judge will uphold a moral clause from 20 years ago. It is vague. It is unenforceable." Jamal shook his head, a cold sweat dripping down his temple onto his starched collar. "It is not vague, Richard. It is terrifyingly specific. Look at the definition of exile in your mother's will. It says the formal and legal removal of a descendant from the family unit." He picked up the voluntary disownment agreement from the desk. His hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. "And look at the title of the document I drafted. Formal Agreement for the Removal and Severance of Nora Vance from the Family Unit." Richard stared at the two documents side by side. The wording was identical. "I used the old family legal files as a template," Jamal confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was being thorough. I thought using the family's standard legal language would make it look more official. I copied and pasted the exact phrasing that triggers the forfeiture clause." Richard looked at his son-in-law. The silence in the room was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock, a sound that suddenly felt like a countdown. "You idiot," Richard whispered. "Richard. You arrogant, incompetent idiot. You did not just evict her, you copy-pasted us into homelessness." Jamal tried to defend himself, retreating behind the desk. "I was trying to protect your assets, Richard. I thought if we legally separated her from the estate, the bank could not come after the house for her debts." "There were no debts," Richard roared, throwing his glass of scotch against the limestone fireplace. The glass shattered, spraying amber liquid over the hearth. "Nora was the one with the assets. We were the ones with the debt. And now the house that secures that debt belongs to the person we just kicked out." Beatrice entered the room looking pale and clutching her pearls. "Why are you shouting?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The neighbors are already watching." "Tell her," Richard said, pointing a shaking finger at Jamal. "Tell your mother-in-law that she is currently standing in Nora's living room." Jamal looked down at his Italian leather shoes, unable to meet Beatrice's eyes. "Technically, Beatrice, we are not even guests," he mumbled. "Since the ownership reverted to Nora the moment the disownment was filed, and since she has not invited us here, legally speaking, we are trespassers." Beatrice gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. "But can we burn it?" she asked, her eyes darting to the fireplace. "The disownment paper. Can we just burn it and pretend it never happened?" Jamal let out a dry, hysterical laugh. "It was notarized, Beatrice. It was filed with the county clerk at 9 a.m. this morning. It is in the public record. Nora probably has a certified copy on her desk right now. We handed her the deed, the keys, and the moral high ground, all with one signature." Richard sank into his leather chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked around the library, a room he had considered his sanctuary for 60 years. He realized with a sick feeling in his stomach that he was sitting in a stranger's house. "We have to call her," he said quietly, staring at the wall. "We have no leverage left. We have to beg." The blackout hit the estate with the subtlety of a heart attack. One moment the crystal chandeliers were blazing overhead, illuminating the panic in the library, and the next we were plunged into a suffocating blindness. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen died. The security system panel by the door let out a dying beep and went dark. The only sound left was the rain hammering against the roof and the heavy, terrified breathing of 4 people who had just realized that electricity was not a natural right but a paid service. Nora Richard shouted into the darkness. She cut the power. That spiteful witch cut the power. Beatrice fumbled for the silver candelabras that usually sat on the dining table as decoration. She lit the tapered candles, her hands shaking so badly that the shadows danced wildly on the walls. We gathered around the small circle of light in the kitchen like refugees in our own home. There was no hot food because the stove was electric. We ate cold leftovers from the party on paper plates because the dishwasher was full and the staff had walked out an hour ago. "This is insane," Kylie whined, staring at her darkened phone screen. "My battery is at 4%. I cannot even call an Uber. How am I supposed to leave? I cannot sleep here. It is creepy." Beatrice slammed her hand down on the table, making the candles jump. "Is that all you care about, Kylie? Your phone battery? We are facing total ruin. We are sitting in a house that legally belongs to the sister you tormented, and all you can think about is your Uber rating." Kylie glared at her mother across the flickering flame. "Do not pretend you are innocent, Mom. You are the one who told me to take her car keys. You are the one who wanted her gone so you could turn her bedroom into a yoga studio. Now that she actually left, you are falling apart." At least Nora knew how to keep the lights on. The slap echoed through the kitchen, sharp and violent. Beatrice had struck Kylie across the face. It was the first time she had ever disciplined her golden child. Kylie touched her cheek in shock, her eyes filling with tears. "You useless girl," Beatrice hissed. "Nora paid the bills. Nora fixed the problems. You just consume. You are a parasite, Kylie, and right now you are feeding on a corpse." Richard ignored the women. He turned his rage toward Jamal, who was sitting with his head in his hands. "Look at him," Richard sneered, pointing a fork at his son-in-law. "The great legal mind. The partner. You sat there and told me that document was ironclad. You told me we were protected." "I made a mistake," Jamal whispered. "A mistake," Richard roared, standing up and knocking his chair over. "You did not make a mistake. You signed our death warrant. You handed my empire over to my enemy on a silver platter because you were too arrogant to read the fine print. You are not a lawyer, Jamal. You are a fraud. And if I lose this house, I will spend the last dollar I have destroying your career before I die." Jamal said nothing. He just stared into the flame of the candle, watching his future burn. Outside, the wind howled around the mansion. Inside, the darkness was not just an absence of light. It was the physical manifestation of the hatred that was finally consuming them all. The sun rose over a house that felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Without electricity, the morning air inside the mansion was stale and humid. Richard Vance sat by the window watching his battery percentage drop to 12%. He had spent the last hour trying to secure a lifeline. He did not call the bank or a lawyer. He called family. He called the people who had eaten his food and drunk his wine less than 48 hours ago. He called the 136 guests who had laughed when he called me a liability. He dialed his brother, my Uncle Ted. Ted was a man Richard had bailed out of a gambling debt in the 90s. Surely Ted would offer a guest room or a temporary loan. The phone rang 4 times before Ted picked up. The background noise sounded like a golf course. "Ted, it is Richard. Listen, we are having some temporary liquidity issues with the bank. A clerical error, really. But the power is out and Beatrice is distraught. We need a place to stay for a few days just until Ted cut him off." His voice was not warm. It was clipped and businesslike, the voice one uses with a telemarketer. "I cannot do that, Richard. I saw the video." "What video?" Richard asked, his grip tightening on the phone. "The video Mrs. Higgins posted on the neighborhood watch group," Ted replied. "The one of the repo men hauling away your sofa while you screamed in your bathrobe. It has 5,000 views, Richard. Everyone has seen it. The club is talking about nothing else. They say you are insolvent. They say the feds are involved." "It is a lie," Richard shouted. "It is a misunderstanding." "I have my own reputation to think about, Richard," Ted said coldly. "If I associate with you right now, the bank might start looking at my accounts too. Financial ruin is contagious. Do not call me again until this is cleared up. And Richard, you still owe me for the wedding gift I bought Kylie. I expect a check. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone in disbelief. He tried my Aunt Linda. She sent him straight to voicemail. He tried his old business partner. Blocked. He tried the cousin who had toasted to his genius at the party. The call failed instantly. Across the room, Beatrice was sobbing quietly. She had just been removed from the Ladies' Charity Committee group chat. The notification had popped up on her screen with a brutal finality. Beatrice Vance has been removed by admin. No explanation. No goodbye. Just a digital erasure. They realized then the true nature of their social circle. These people were not friends. They were remora fish attached to a shark waiting for scraps. Now that the shark was bleeding, the fish were not trying to help. They were swimming away as fast as possible so they would not be eaten by the bigger predators circling the water. Richard looked at his contact list. 136 names. 136 people who had filled his house with noise and laughter. And now, when he was sitting in the dark facing the end of his world, not a single one of them would offer him a glass of water. He was not just broke, he was a social leper. He dropped the phone onto the rug. The screen cracked, but he did not care. There was no one left to call. The silence in the house was absolute, and for the first time in his life, Richard Vance understood the crushing weight of being truly alone. The sun rose on the third day, bringing a cold, gray light that illuminated the wreckage of the Vance dynasty. Inside the mansion, Richard huddled by the window using the last 2% of his phone battery to check the news. He was hoping for a miracle. He was hoping to see a sudden rebound in the stock market or a headline about a bank bailout. Instead, what he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. The breaking news alert flashed across his screen in urgent red letters. FBI raids, Henderson Financial in massive tax fraud investigation. Richard clicked the link with trembling fingers. The video loaded slowly on the weak data signal. It showed the glass doors of the office building where he had played poker just last week. But this time, there were no smiling receptionists. There were federal agents in windbreakers carrying boxes of files. And then the camera zoomed in on the main entrance. Mr. Henderson, the man who had fired me for a moral deficit, was being led out in handcuffs. He looked disheveled. His tie was gone, his jacket was draped over his head to hide his face, and he was weeping. The reporter's voice was breathless. Sources say the investigation was triggered by an anonymous whistleblower who provided a comprehensive digital dossier late last night. The evidence allegedly details a decade of money laundering, offshore tax evasion, and the embezzlement of client funds. Richard dropped the phone. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. He knew exactly who the whistleblower was. He looked at Jamal, who was staring at the floor. She didn't just lock him out. Richard whispered, his voice hoarse with terror. She turned him in. You have to understand something about forensic accountants. We do not just count money. We trace sins. For 5 years, I sat in Henderson's office quietly fixing his ledgers. I saw every bribe disguised as a consulting fee. I saw every offshore transfer hidden in a shell company. I saw every dirty dollar he tried to wash. I never said a word because he was my employer, and I was a professional. I kept my files encrypted and I kept my mouth shut. But Mr. Henderson made a fatal calculation. He assumed my silence was bought with a paycheck. He forgot that when you fire the person who knows where the bodies are buried, you better make sure they do not have a shovel. When he terminated me for cause, he voided my non-disclosure agreement. And when he insulted my family, he gave me the motivation to open the archives. I sent the files to the SEC and the FBI at midnight. I titled the email The Clean Ledger. It contained 3 gigabytes of PDFs, emails, and bank transfer records. It was a roadmap to prison, and Henderson was driving the bus. Richard stood up, pacing the room in a blind panic. I did business with him. I invested in his funds. If they have his books, they have my name. Beatrice began to cry again, a high, thin sound of despair. Nora is going to send us all to jail, she sobbed. No, Richard said, stopping in front of the window. She is not sending us to jail. She is systematically destroying every pillar of support we have. She took the money. She took the house. She took the reputation, and now she just took out our last ally. He looked at the police cruiser that was still parked at the bottom of the driveway, ensuring no assets were removed. "We are not a family anymore," he whispered. "We are targets, and she is not missing a single shot." The knock on the heavy oak door was not the polite tap of a guest. It was the authoritative pound of the law. Jamal adjusted his wrinkled shirt and walked to the foyer, expecting to see the police or perhaps another news crew looking for a soundbite. He opened the door to find a process server standing there, holding 4 thick manila envelopes. The man did not smile. He simply verified the names of the occupants and shoved the stack of legal documents into Jamal's chest before turning on his heel and marching back to his unmarked sedan. Jamal walked back into the library where my parents were sitting in the gloom. Richard looked up with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Is it a settlement offer?" he asked. Did she finally realize she went too far? Jamal ripped open the top envelope. His hands were shaking as he scanned the header of the document. He was expecting a lawsuit for damages. He was ready to fight a civil claim for the credit card debt or the car lease. He was prepared to argue that my emotional distress was not worth a monetary value. But as his eyes moved down the page, his knees gave out and he sank onto the arm of the sofa. "What is it?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "How much does she want?" "She does not want money," Jamal whispered, his voice hollow. "She is not suing us for damages, Richard. This is an unlawful detainer." Kylie looked up from her dead phone. "A what? Speak English, Jamal." "It is an eviction notice," Jamal said, looking at them with wide, terrified eyes. "She is formally evicting us from the property." Richard stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "She cannot evict me from my own home. I raised her in this house. This is my property." "Not anymore," Jamal said, holding up the document. "See this exhibit attached to the complaint. It is the deed. The moment we filed that disownment paper, the ownership reverted to the trust. And because I drafted the disownment to successfully argue that we are no longer family, we have lost our status as guests." He flipped to the next page. "It says here that as of 9 a.m. yesterday morning, we are classified as unauthorized squatters. She is not asking for rent. She is asking for immediate possession of the premises. And because she filed it as an emergency motion due to property damage caused by the repo men, the court has granted an expedited hearing." "Property damage?" Beatrice gasped. "We didn't damage anything. They scratched the floors when they took the piano," Jamal read from the affidavit. "And since Nora is now the landlord, she is holding us responsible for the destruction of her property. She has given us 24 hours to vacate the premises, or the sheriff will be authorized to physically remove us and place our remaining personal belongings on the curb." The room fell silent. The reality of their situation crashed down on them like a tidal wave. They were not just broke. They were about to be homeless. The house that had been the symbol of their status, the fortress that had protected them from the world, was now a weapon in my hands. "We have nowhere to go," Kylie whimpered. "The hotels won't take us without a credit card. The neighbors won't talk to us. Where are we supposed to sleep tomorrow?" Richard looked around the library at the empty shelves and the cold fireplace. He realized for the first time that the walls were not protecting him. They were closing in. He looked at the eviction notice in Jamal's hand and saw my name typed in bold letters at the top. Plaintiff Nora Vance. It was the only name in the family that still carried any weight, and it was the name that was kicking them out into the street. Desperation has a distinct smell. It smells like stale Scotch cold sweat and the ozone tang of a dying lie. With the eviction notice ticking down like a bomb, Richard Vance decided to play his final card. He did not choose dignity. He chose theater. My phone rang at 7 in the evening. I was reviewing the final liquidation protocols for the estate when I saw his name. I answered on the speakerphone. "Nora." His voice was a wet, ragged gasp. "Nora, please. It is my chest. The pain. I think this is it." I leaned back in my chair. For a normal daughter, this would be the moment of panic. The moment I would drop everything, rush to the hospital, and beg for forgiveness just to keep him alive. But I am not a normal daughter, and Richard is not a normal father. He had pulled this exact stunt in 2008 when the market crashed, and he needed a loan from my grandfather. He had a miraculous recovery the moment the check cleared. I am calling 911, I said calmly. No. He wheezed, urgency creeping into his performance. No hospitals. The press. They will see me. Just come home, Nora, please. I just want to see my daughter before I go. He hung up, leaving the silence to do the heavy lifting. He was betting on my guilt. He was betting that 34 years of biological conditioning would override my legal strategy. He was wrong. I did not grab my car keys. I grabbed my other phone and dialed Dr. Aris, my concierge physician. He was a man who charged $2,000 for a house call and valued discretion above all else. Go to the estate, I told him. Assess the patient. If he is dying, call an ambulance. If he is acting, call me. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a FaceTime request from Dr. Aris. I accepted the video call. The screen showed my father lying on the leather sofa in the library, clutching his chest with theatrical agony. Beatrice was hovering over him, weeping into a handkerchief, while Kylie stood awkwardly in the corner, filming it for a sympathy vlog. Dr. Aris turned the camera to face himself. His expression was bored. Ms. Vance, I have performed a full EKG, checked his troponin levels, and monitored his vitals for 20 minutes. And I asked, his heart is as strong as an ox. Dr. Aris reported, his voice flat and clinical. His blood pressure is slightly elevated, but that is likely due to the significant amount of alcohol in his system and the exertion of shouting at me. There is absolutely no evidence of a cardiac event. This is a panic attack coupled with acute histrionics. Richard sat up instantly, the agony vanishing from his face, replaced by fury. You are a quack, he shouted at the doctor. Get out of my house. Dr. Aris turned the phone back to Richard. I believe your daughter has something to say to you, Mr. Vance. I looked at my father on the small screen. He looked small. He looked caught. Nice try, Dad, I said, my voice echoing in the silent library. But medical fraud is not going to stop the sheriff. You wasted my doctor's time and you wasted your last chance at dignity. But Nora, Richard stammered, trying to pivot back to the victim role. I am an old man. The stress, it could kill me. Then I suggest you start packing, I replied. Physical labor is great for stress relief. And Dad, Dr. Aris will be billing you for the house call. He accepts cash only. I ended the call. I sat there for a moment, feeling the final thread of guilt snap. He wasn't heartbroken that he had lost me. He was heartbroken that his manipulation had stopped working. The last weapon in his arsenal was a fake heart attack, and it had just been diffused by a stethoscope. Now there was nothing standing between them and the street. The elevator ride to the 45th floor of the prestigious law firm usually made Jamal feel like a master of the universe. Today the silence inside the cabin was deafening. He adjusted his tie in the mirrored wall, trying to hide the dark circles under his eyes. He had spent the night on a hard chair in the dark Vance mansion, listening to Richard weep and Beatrice scream. He needed this job. He needed the salary to bail them out. He stepped out into the lobby, expecting the usual morning greeting from the receptionist. Instead, she looked down at her computer screen and pretended to type. Mr. Blackwood wants to see you in the main conference room immediately, she said without looking up. Her voice was icy. Jamal felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He walked down the hallway past the glass-walled offices of his colleagues. They stopped talking as he passed. They stared. He was not just a partner anymore. He was a viral sensation. The video of the repo men at his in-laws' house had been trending on Twitter for 12 hours. He pushed open the heavy doors of the conference room. The entire executive committee was seated around the long mahogany table. In the center of the table sat a single document. It was the voluntary disownment agreement he had drafted with such pride just 2 days ago. Sit down, Jamal, Mr. Blackwood said. He did not offer coffee. He did not smile. Jamal sat. Listen, Arthur, I know the optics are bad. He began, his voice trembling. But the family situation is complicated. I can explain. This is not about optics. Jamal Blackwood cut him off. This is about competence. We reviewed your work on the Vance estate restructuring, specifically this document. Blackwood slid the paper across the table. You drafted an instrument to sever legal ties between a daughter and her family, a standard procedure, but in doing so, you failed to conduct basic due diligence regarding the underlying asset structures. Did you, or did you not read the original 1999 will of Eleanor Vance before executing this agreement? Jamal swallowed hard. I assumed the deed was standard fee, simple. You assumed, Blackwood repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. You assumed. Because of your assumption, you triggered a reversion clause that cost your client a $20 million property. You committed legal malpractice, Jamal. You drafted the eviction notice for your own wife and father-in-law, and you handed it to the opposing party on a silver platter. I can fix it, Jamal stammered. I can challenge the will. You will do no such thing, Blackwood said, standing up. We received a call from the State Bar Association this morning. They are opening an inquiry into your conduct, citing gross negligence and conflict of interest. You are a liability, Jamal. We cannot have a partner who does not know how to read a deed. Blackwood pointed to the door. You are terminated, effective immediately. Security is waiting to escort you to your desk to collect your personal effects. Do not touch your computer. Your access has already been revoked. Jamal stood up. His legs felt like lead. But my partnership buy-in, he whispered. I put $500,000 into this firm. Per the morality clause in your partnership agreement, Blackwood said with a cruel smile, which you also signed without reading, you forfeit your buy-in for bringing disrepute to the firm. Good day, Jamal. Jamal walked out of the conference room. The walk to the elevator felt like a funeral march. He had walked in as a high-powered attorney. He was walking out as the man who sued himself and lost. He pressed the down button, realizing that for the first time in his life, he had absolutely nowhere to go. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive hush, revealing the reception area of my new firm, Vance Capital. The space smelled of fresh lilies and aggressive success. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, did not look up from her monitor. She simply pressed a button on her desk, and the frosted glass doors to my private office clicked unlocked. You can go in now, she said, without a hint of warmth. She has exactly 10 minutes. The four of them shuffled into my office like a chain gang marching to the gallows. The contrast was brutal. My office was a sanctuary of light and modern art, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city they used to think they owned. They looked like the wreckage of a natural disaster. Richard was wearing the same suit he had on yesterday, but it was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He hadn't shaved and his eyes were bloodshot. Beatrice was hiding behind oversized sunglasses, clutching her Hermes bag as if it contained the last of her dignity. Kylie looked small and gray, her phone dead in her hand. Jamal trailed behind them, looking like a man who had just been told he had 24 hours to live. I did not stand up. I did not offer them water. I sat behind my desk, which was a slab of reclaimed black marble, and continued to type on my laptop. I let the silence stretch for a full 60 seconds. I wanted them to feel every tick of the clock. I wanted them to understand that their time was no longer valuable. Finally, I stopped typing and looked up. You requested a meeting, I said, my voice flat and professional. You have 9 minutes left. Richard cleared his throat. He tried to straighten his tie, but his hands were shaking too badly. Nora, he began, his voice cracking. This has gone too far. We are your family. You cannot just throw us out on the street. It is unnatural. It is business, Richard. I corrected him, leaning back in my leather chair. You taught me that. You said business is about leverage. Right now I have the deed, the mortgage, and the eviction order. You have a foreclosure notice and a bad credit score. Beatrice stepped forward, taking off her sunglasses to reveal eyes swollen from crying. We have nowhere to go, Nora, she sobbed. The hotels won't take us. The club suspended our membership. We slept in the car last night, in the Audi. Do you know how humiliating that is? I looked at her without blinking. I remember when I was 12 and you made me sleep in the guest room for a month because you needed my bedroom to store your winter coat collection, I said calmly. I remember you telling me that comfort was a privilege, not a right. Consider this a lesson in gratitude, Mother. Jamal stepped forward, placing his briefcase on my desk. He looked defeated. Nora, please. I lost my job today. The firm fired me for gross negligence because of the disownment papers. My career is over. If you enforce the eviction, we will be destitute. We are asking for a grace period, just 30 days. I picked up a file from my desk. It was the eviction order. I looked at Jamal. You drafted the document that severed our legal ties, Jamal. You created the loophole that gave me the house. You are not a victim of my cruelty. You are a victim of your own incompetence. I stood up, walking around the desk to lean against the edge. My heels clicked on the hardwood floor, sharp and precise. Here is the reality, I said, looking at each of them in turn. I am not going to save you. I am not going to fix this. For 34 years, I was the glue holding this family together. I was the bank. I was the emotional sponge, and you hated me for it. You treated me like an employee you couldn't fire. Well, you finally fired me. And now you are realizing that the employee was the only one doing any work. Richard slammed his hand on the desk, but there was no power in it. What do you want, Nora? He begged. Just tell us what you want. I walked to the door and opened it. I want you to leave, I said, pointing to the elevator. My next client is here, and unlike you, he can actually afford my rates. Before you walk out that door, Richard, there is one final administrative matter we need to settle. I opened the thin black leather folder on my desk. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. It was not a lawsuit. It was an invoice. I slid the paper across the polished marble surface toward my father. He looked at it warily, like it was a loaded gun. What is this? He asked, his voice trembling. It is a bill for services rendered, I replied, leaning back in my chair. You see, for the last 10 years, I have acted as the de facto chief financial officer for the Vance Family Trust. I managed your real estate portfolio. I handled your tax compliance. I negotiated your insurance premiums. I did all of this without a contract and without a salary because I was under the impression that we were a family. I paused, letting the word family hang in the air like a guillotine blade. However, since you and Jamal were so thorough in legally establishing that I am no longer a member of this family, I must retroactively reclassify my labor. I am now billing you as an independent consultant. Richard looked down at the paper. His eyes widened as he read the first line item. Executive asset management fees, 10 years at market rate, $1.2 million. I continued, my voice calm and precise. The average salary for a CFO in New York City is $150,000 a year. I gave you a discount. I pointed to the second line. Unauthorized use of intellectual property, $500,000. That is for the proprietary accounting software you used to run the family office. The same software Henderson stole. You have been using my code to track your dividends for 5 years without a license. That is a felony, but I am willing to settle for a flat fee. Beatrice gasped, looking over Richard's shoulder. This is extortion, she shrieked. You cannot charge us for helping your own parents. I ignored her and pointed to the largest figure on the page. Item 3. Defamation of character and professional reputational damage. $3 million. $3 million. Richard choked out. You are insane. You announced to a room of 136 high-net-worth individuals that I was fired for a moral deficit. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You destroyed my reputation in my primary market. You made me unemployable in the corporate sector. In civil court, that is called slander per se. $3 million is actually a conservative estimate of my future lost earnings. I watched them do the math. They were staring at a total of $4.7 million. But I am a fair woman, I said, picking up a pen. I saw the itemized list of childhood expenses you sent me when I was 18. You claimed I cost you $550,000 to raise. boarding school, braces, ballet lessons. I wrote a figure at the bottom of the invoice. I have applied a credit of $550,000 against the total balance. I am paying you back for my childhood, Richard. Every single penny. I turned the paper around so they could see the final number circled in red ink. That brings the total amount due to $4,150,000. Payment is due in 30 days. If the balance is not cleared, I will attach a lien to every remaining asset you have, including your pension and your Social Security checks. Richard stared at the number. He looked at me. He realized then that he had not just lost a daughter. He had awakened a creditor. And I was the kind of creditor who never wrote off a bad debt. Please leave my office, I said, returning to my laptop. The meter is running on my time, and you can no longer afford me. The silence in my office was broken by a sound that was pathetic and terrifying in equal measure. It was the sound of a grown man's pride snapping in half. Jamal did not just argue, he physically collapsed. His knees hit the plush carpet with a heavy thud, and he grabbed the edge of my desk, looking up at me with eyes that were red and desperate. Nora, please, he choked out. You have to stop this. I lost my job this morning. Blackwood fired me. They took my partnership equity. They are reporting me to the Bar Association. If you enforce this debt, I will be bankrupt by Monday. My parents watched in horror. Richard looked away, unable to see his son-in-law begging. Beatrice put a hand to her mouth. But I did not look away. I watched Jamal closely. This was the man who had sneered at me across the dinner table for 5 years. This was the man who had called me a glorified calculator while drinking wine I paid for. Stand up, Jamal, I said, my voice cold and devoid of pity. You are wrinkling your suit and you can no longer afford the dry cleaning. He did not stand. He gripped the desk tighter. I was just doing my job, Nora. Your father told me to draft the papers. I was trying to protect the family assets. I never wanted to hurt you. I can help you. I can be your legal counsel. I know where Richard hides the offshore accounts. Just forgive the debt. Please. I spun my chair slowly to face him fully. I looked down at him with the clinical detachment of a surgeon looking at a tumor. You are a lawyer, Jamal, I said. You spent 3 years in law school and 10 years in corporate litigation. You know the fundamental rule of our profession better than anyone. I picked up the voluntary disownment agreement, the document he had been so proud of 48 hours ago. Scripta manet, I said softly. The written word remains. In this country, we do not govern by feelings or intentions or tears. We govern by what is signed in wet ink. You drafted this weapon, Jamal. You sharpened the blade. You aimed it at my chest. And now that the recoil has blown your arm off, you want me to pretend the gun never went off. But I didn't know. Jamal sobbed. I didn't know about the moral clause. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, especially for the attorney who wrote the contract. I replied. You taught me that principle yourself when I asked for a raise 3 years ago. You told me that if it wasn't in the contract, it didn't exist. Well, Jamal, look at the paper. Mercy is not in the contract. Forgiveness is not in the contract. I dropped the document back onto the desk. It landed with a final slap. You are not a victim here. You are a casualty of your own incompetence. A good lawyer reads the fine print. A great lawyer anticipates the consequences. You did neither. You are a liability, Jamal, and I do not hire liabilities. Now get off my floor before I charge you for the carpet cleaning. Jamal scrambled back to his feet, wiping his dignity off his knees and retreating to the corner of the room. He was a broken man, but he was no longer my primary concern. I turned my attention to the man who had started it all. Richard Vance was staring at the invoice on the desk, but he was not doing the math on the money. He was doing the math on his freedom. You saw the news this morning, I said, my voice low and even. You saw Henderson being led out in handcuffs with his jacket over his head. You know why that happened? Richard nodded slowly, his face gray. You gave them the books, he whispered. I gave them the map. I corrected him. I gave the FBI a turn-by-turn navigation of every shell company, every offshore wire, and every falsified deduction Henderson made in the last decade. And do you know what the most interesting part of those files was, Richard? It was how often your name appeared in the margins. Beatrice let out a small, strangled sound, but Richard silenced her with a wave of his hand. He knew exactly what was at stake. He knew that the only difference between him and Henderson was that I had not yet pressed send on the second email draft sitting in my outbox. I slid a heavy document across the black marble desk. It sat next to the invoice like a cure sitting next to a poison. This is a transfer of assets and general release, I explained. It assigns 100% of your remaining equity in Vance Development to me. It transfers the title of the Audi, the rights to your grandfather's watch collection, and the remaining balance of your Cayman Island accounts. Richard looked at the document. This is everything, he said, his voice trembling. This leaves me with zero. I will be a pauper. You will be a pauper with a clean record, I replied. If you sign this, I delete the draft. I lose the USB drive containing your tax returns from 2015 to the present. You walk out of here with no money, but you also walk out without an indictment. It is a very generous trade. He picked up the Mont Blanc pen. It was the same pen he had used to sign my birthday cards with a stamped signature. His hand hovered over the paper. He looked at Beatrice, who was staring at the floor, unable to watch her lifestyle evaporate. He looked at Kylie, who was still trying to get a signal on her dead phone. He realized that he had no legacy left to protect only his own skin. If I sign this, he asked, his voice barely audible, will you let us stay in the guest house? Just for a week. I leaned forward. The guest house is being renovated into a server room for my new company, I said coldly. You have 1 minute to sign, Richard, or I call the agent who arrested Henderson. He is expecting to hear from me. Richard let out a long, shuddering breath. He pressed the pen to the paper. The scratch of the nib was the loudest sound in the room. He signed his name quickly as if the pen was burning his fingers. He signed away the company he built, the fortune he stole, and the future he thought he deserved. He pushed the paper back to me and dropped the pen. It is done, he whispered. I picked up the document and checked the signature. It was valid. I closed the folder and placed it in my drawer. Smart choice, Dad, I said, standing up. You are officially bankrupt. But at least you will not have to wear orange. Now get out of my office. I have a company to run. The deadline was exactly 12 o'clock noon. At 11:55, the sheriff of Greenwich County stood in the center of the grand foyer, checking his watch with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He was not a private security guard or a hired thug. He was the highest law enforcement officer in the district, and he was there to enforce the unlawful detainer writ I had filed. Richard was frantically trying to stuff a box with the silver candelabras from the dining room. He was sweating, moving with the desperate, jerky motions of a thief in his own home. The sheriff stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on the box. Put it back. Mr. Vance, the sheriff said, his voice calm but absolute. The court order is specific. You are permitted to remove clothing, toiletries, and personal photographs. Any item with a resale value, including silverware, art, and electronics, is the property of the estate. That means it belongs to the plaintiff. But these are family heirlooms, Richard sputtered, clutching a silver fork. They have the Vance crest. And the Vance estate now belongs to Nora Vance, the sheriff replied, taking the fork from Richard's hand and dropping it back onto the table with a loud clatter. Move along, sir. You have 3 minutes. Beatrice appeared at the top of the stairs. She was wearing 3 fur coats layered on top of each other despite the 80-degree heat outside. She looked like a deranged animal attempting to smuggle her own skin. She was dragging a suitcase that was clearly too heavy for her. Stop right there, ma'am, a deputy said, blocking her path. Open the bag, Beatrice shrieked. You cannot search my luggage. This is a violation of my privacy. The deputy did not argue. He simply unzipped the suitcase. Inside, wrapped in silk scarves, were the Faberge eggs from the display case and the diamond tiara she had worn to the gala. This is asset concealment, the sheriff said, shaking his head. Leave the bag. You can take the clothes on your back and 1 coat. The rest stays. Beatrice began to weep, trying to hold on to the handle of the suitcase. It is mine, she wailed. I earned this. You bought it with money that has been recalled, the sheriff said, signaling the deputy to escort her down the stairs. Kylie was the last to emerge. She walked out of her bedroom carrying a single plastic trash bag. She had tried to pack her designer handbags, but the deputies had checked the receipts and found they were all paid for by the company card. They had confiscated her laptop, her iPad, and her camera equipment. She was left with her makeup bag, a few changes of clothes, and a pair of sneakers. She looked at the sheriff with dead eyes. "Can I keep my hair straightener?" she asked, her voice devoid of its usual arrogance. The sheriff looked at the cheap plastic tool. "Go ahead," he said. They gathered on the front porch. The driveway was empty. There were no luxury SUVs waiting to whisk them away. There was only a yellow taxi idling at the gate because I had graciously prepaid the fare to a budget motel in Queens. Richard looked back at the massive stone house. He looked at the windows he had boasted about. He looked at the manicured lawn he had never mowed himself. "This isn't right," he whispered. "A father shouldn't leave his house like this." The sheriff stepped out onto the porch behind them. He grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double doors. "Time is up, folks," the sheriff said. He pulled the doors shut. The sound was heavy and final, echoing like a gunshot across the valley. The lock clicked. The sheriff turned to them, holding the key up to the light before dropping it into an evidence bag marked "Property of Nora Vance." "You need to clear the premises immediately," the sheriff said, pointing to the gate. "If you return, you will be arrested for trespassing." Richard, Beatrice, and Kylie stood there for a moment, a huddled mass of failure on the concrete. Then slowly they turned and began the long walk down the driveway, dragging their trash bags behind them, leaving the castle to its rightful queen. 6 months later, the Vance dynasty had relocated from a 10,000-square-foot estate to a 2-bedroom walk up in Queens that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and regret. The walls were paper-thin, allowing Richard to hear every argument his neighbors had about money, which was ironic, considering he no longer had any money to argue about. He sat in a recliner he had found on the curb, watching a small television that only picked up 4 channels. He was drinking a generic brand of beer that tasted like copper. Beatrice was in the kitchenette trying to heat up a frozen dinner in a microwave that sparked every time she touched it. She was wearing a tracksuit she had bought at a thrift store. The silk and fur were gone, sold to a pawn shop to pay the security deposit. She muttered to herself constantly, a running commentary on the injustice of the universe. The door opened and Kylie walked in. She did not look like an influencer anymore. She looked exhausted. She was wearing a polyester uniform with a name tag that read "Diner Staff." Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she smelled like stale grease and maple syrup. She kicked off her orthopedic shoes and slumped onto the sofa next to Richard. "How was the shift?" Beatrice asked, not looking up from the microwave. "Did you make enough for the electric bill?" Kylie reached into her apron and pulled out a wad of crumpled $1 bills. $40 in tips," she said, tossing the money onto the coffee table. "A guy threw a drink at me because his fries were cold. I realized halfway through cleaning it up that he used to follow me on Instagram." Richard stared at the small pile of cash. "That is it," he grumbled. "That won't even cover the late fee. You need to work a double shift tomorrow." "I am tired, Dad," Kylie snapped. "I am on my feet for 10 hours a day while you sit here feeling sorry for yourself. Why don't you get a job?" "I am a visionary," Richard shouted, hitting the arm of the chair. "I am overqualified for manual labor. I am strategizing our comeback." While they argued over $40 and a frozen lasagna, the sun was shining on the other side of the city. The gates of the Vance estate were wide open for the first time in decades. There were no security guards checking IDs. There were no signs warning away trespassers. Instead, there was a new bronze plaque on the stone pillar. It read, "The Eleanor Vance Center for Financial Literacy and Youth Empowerment." I stood on the balcony of the master bedroom, watching the transformation below. The manicured lawn where my mother used to host her exclusive garden parties was now filled with picnic tables. A group of students from the inner city was sitting there holding textbooks, learning how to code. The garage that had housed the luxury cars was being converted into a computer lab. I walked down the grand staircase. The portrait of my father was gone, replaced by a mural painted by local artists. The oppressive silence of the mansion had been replaced by the sound of laughter and the scratching of pens on paper. I walked into the library, the room where Jamal had found the will and Richard had faked his heart attack. The liquor cabinet was empty. The shelves were filled with books on economics, law, and mathematics. A young girl looked up from her desk as I entered. "Excuse me, Miss Vance," she said, holding up a calculator. "I think I found a mistake in this equation." I smiled, pulling up a chair next to her. "Let me see," I said. "In this house we fix mistakes. We don't hide them." I looked out the window at the vibrant life filling the grounds. My family was living in a prison of their own making, trapped by their inability to change. I was living in a fortress of opportunity. They had wanted a legacy of wealth. I built a legacy of worth. And for the first time, the house felt like a home. The traffic light at the intersection of Queens Boulevard turned red. I eased my foot onto the brake, feeling the smooth deceleration of my new car. It was not the Audi. That car was cursed. This was a vintage convertible bought with my own money, registered in my own name and paid for in full. I tapped my fingers on the leather steering wheel, enjoying the rhythm of the city. The air was crisp and cold, but I had the top down, letting the wind mess up my hair because for the first time in my life, I did not have to be perfect. I just had to be present. To my right was a greasy spoon diner with neon signage that flickered even in the daylight. Through the plate glass window, I saw a figure wiping down a laminate table. The motion was sluggish and resentful. I recognized the posture immediately. It was the slump of someone who realized the world did not owe them a living. It was Kylie. Her uniform was stained with mustard, and her hair, once a masterpiece of salon engineering, was pulled back in a fraying scrunchie. She was scrubbing a stubborn stain on the table while a customer pointed at it and yelled. Kylie looked up. Her eyes met mine through the glass. For a second time stood still. She saw the Italian leather seats. She saw the designer sunglasses. She saw the peace on my face. She froze, holding a dirty rag in her hand. The old Kylie would have screamed. The old Kylie would have run out and banged on the hood demanding money. But this Kylie just looked at the rag in her hand and then looked at the floor. She turned her back to the street, hiding her face in the shadow of the kitchen. She was finally learning the one lesson our parents never taught her. Shame is a powerful teacher. I did not feel pity. Pity is a luxury for people who have not been abused. I felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice does not always look like a gavel banging in a courtroom. Sometimes justice looks like a spoiled girl learning the value of $1 the hard way. The light turned green. I did not honk. I did not wave. I simply shifted gears and let the car glide forward. I watched the diner disappear in the side mirror, shrinking until it was just a speck of grease in the distance. I turned my eyes back to the road ahead. The highway stretched out before me, wide and open and infinite. People say family is everything. They say you should forgive blood no matter how much it bleeds you dry. They are wrong. Family is not a biological accident. It is a choice. It is a circle of mutual respect, and when that circle is broken, you have to walk out of it to survive. I looked at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. I had paid the debt. I had balanced the ledger. I had fired the toxic clients and liquidated the bad assets. The invoice was paid in full. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, sharp air of autonomy. Freedom has a price tag attached to it. It costs you your past. It costs you the illusion of safety. It costs you the people who claimed to love you only when you were useful. But as I accelerated onto the highway, leaving the wreckage of the Vance dynasty behind, I realized something profound. It was a bargain. I smiled at the road ahead. The account is closed. The story of Nora Vance offers a profound lesson on the difference between loyalty and servitude. For years, Nora believed that her value was tied to her utility. She acted as the silent engine keeping a broken vehicle moving, hoping that one day the passengers would thank her for the ride. They never did. The Vances illustrate a dangerous truth about human nature, which is that people will exploit your kindness until you create a boundary that makes exploitation impossible. They mistook her silence for weakness and her generosity for obligation. But the moment Nora presented her invoice, she taught us that self-respect is not given, it is negotiated. The collapse of her family was not an act of vengeance, it was simply the result of gravity taking over once the prop was removed. This story reminds us that you cannot build a healthy life on a foundation of disrespect. If you are the smartest person in the room, but you are treated like a servant, you are not in a family, you are in a hostile workplace. Nora showed that true power is not about shouting the loudest. It is about owning the keys, the codes, and the contracts. It is about knowing that your dignity has a market value and refusing to offer a discount. Walking away from toxic people is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. You must be willing to let others fall if holding them up is breaking your back. The ultimate victory is not seeing them fail. It is seeing yourself thrive without them. Audit your life today and stop financing people who cannot afford to respect you.